Ties between South Africa and the US remain tense. It started with President Donald Trump inaccurately and without evidence accusing South Africa of confiscating land from white farmers. He then froze aid to the country, and his Secretary of State skipped a key G20 foreign ministers meeting. South Africa has so far refused to yield, saying instead that it is the victim of misinformation. Hello there, and welcome to Africanews Debates. My name is Ronald Kato. On this episode, we ask, is South Africa's defiance a brave stand or a diplomatic disaster? So 2 weeks ago, the standoff between Washington and Pretoria escalated further, with the US expelling South Africa's ambassador for making unflattering comments about Donald Trump. I will introduce my panel in a minute, but first, this news story to set the tone for today's Africanews debate.
The South African presidency has expressed regret over the expulsion of its ambassador to the US, Ebrahim Rasool. In a post on X, South Africa has called on all stakeholders to maintain diplomatic decorum in handling the matter and reiterated its commitment to a strong relationship with the US. The statement comes after the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, announced on Friday that Rasool was no longer welcome, accusing him of being a race-baiting politician critical of President Donald Trump. Rubio's statement followed a webinar where Rasool discussed demographic shifts in the US and the Trump administration's policies. This rare diplomatic move comes amid rising tensions between the US and South Africa over a controversial land law and claims made by Trump about discrimination against South Africa's white minority. South Africa has denied these claims, emphasising that its new land law is aimed at correcting historical injustices from the apartheid era.
Thank you for joining us once again. We're streaming live on our social media platforms, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Feel free to head over there and make your views known. So I have Menzi Ndlovu, is a political risk analyst, joining us from Cape Town. Good afternoon, Menzi.
Good afternoon, sir.
Thank you for joining us. I have also Sanusha Naidu, is a political analyst and senior research fellow and an associate with the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. Good afternoon, Sanusha.
Good afternoon, Ronald. Good afternoon to my fellow panelists.
Thank you. And I have Dr. Philani Mthembu, is the Executive Director of the Institute for Global Dialogue. Philani, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Can I begin with you, Philani? A lot has happened between Washington and Pretoria since February, or I should say a lot has happened to Pretoria coming from Washington since February. Why hasn't South Africa reciprocated?
Well, I think it's the manner in which the engagement has been. I mean, much of what has been coming from the White House is not based on a factual analysis of South Africa's domestic or international relations. But also, I think there is an understanding from South Africa that much of what we see, yes, the style, the tone is different, but much of what we see is not necessarily coming just from the Trump administration. The decision by Congress to review the relationship between South Africa and the United States, that precedes Trump. That came through the Biden administration, and tensions were already there. But I would even argue, going back over the last 30 years, South Africa has always had to manage the relationship between the two countries. Going way back to 1990, when President Mandela was released from prison, going to a US audience with Ted Koppel, where he was questioned about the ANC's relationship with Colonel Gaddafi, with Fidel Castro, and also with Yasser Arafat. And he said, do not choose who our enemies are and who our friends are. We're quite capable of doing that ourselves. So South Africa has always managed this relationship, whereas it's had relatively good economic relations. But on the political front, there have been tensions from time to time over the last 30 years.
Sanusha, South Africa is the only African country that's a member of the G20. In fact, it holds the G20 presidency for this year, and until until last year, no, until 2023, they were the only African member of the BRICS. Would you say what is happening to South Africa is the US is trying to make it an example of what happens to a developing country that refuses to toe the US line?
Well, Ronald, I think it builds on what Palani is saying. I mean, it's not just about whether South Africa is not towing a line. I think it's really about a US architecture around a global system that has been ventilated and underwritten by Washington, that has actually evolved into various changing and shifting dynamics around global conditions and structural conditions. It's not just about South Africa and whether South Africa belongs to the BRICS and it belongs to the G20, or that it has relationships with Russia, China, or Iran, which is constantly cited as rogue nations, or it has military exercises and military drills with Iran or whatever. I think it's really about the identity of the US coming to terms with an international system that is now in a state of fluidity. It's at an inflection point, and it's really now understanding that these rules-based system that you had underwritten and you had created, which wasn't really always about equivalency. It was always about how you use the rules-based system for your own interests, but also for your own kind of reciprocal engagements, now is in a state of where it's no longer that viability. And I think the challenge with South Africa is really around the fact that it's a country where I think the idea of how you actually use these different dynamics. I mean, we kind of have to raise that same question with our other BRIC partners, in particular, like India, who was able to fashion out a very interesting strategic alignment with the US. And the US doesn't really take this architecture in the way that it kind of dovetails with the reaction to South Africa. So the question really now is the unevenness and the duplicitous nature of the international system. Why South Africa, and why not another country that is also part of these different kind of international groupings? I think it's very simplified to just use that argument and say that it's because South Africa is in the BRICS or it's because South Africa is in the G20. I think the point that Palani was making around President Mandela as well is that there has been an issue. And I think when you listen to Ambassador Rasool, when he returned from Washington a week ago, and he gave an impromptu address to the people that were at the airport to receive him in Cape Town, he made a very interesting point when one of the journalists asked him and said, what you said, was that what you were saying? Was it as a diplomatic issue? And he said, no, it was an assessment, a political analysis. And I think that's the challenge, is the US is going through its own existential kind of structural changes with regard to its internal dynamics. And the question is, that has been ventilated for the longest time in terms of how it used the domestic to try and articulate a foreign policy that was essentially around deflecting attention from internal dynamics. If we go back to the 9/11 and how the reaction to 9/11, if we go back to 1990 and the war on Iraq in terms of the issue of Kuwait, if we look at that issue, those issues, it's all kind of when a foreign policy becomes part of a domestication and you need to move forward. I'm not saying that what we are doing in South Africa and what's going on globally is a need to say that there's a right and a wrong, but I think we are in an existential crisis of the global architecture.
Menzi, how would you characterize South Africa's response so far?
I would say it's kind of mixed. So there are elements of it that show some kind of strategic calculation, but then there are also some elements of it that show that the government wasn't necessarily prepared for this moment, and this moment being an administration that is as hawkish as the Trump administration. And very early on, when there were signs that Trump would likely be elected into power this year, there were warnings that were made by key individuals within the diplomatic sphere that we need to brace ourselves for a change. And Trump himself and the individuals that surrounded Trump also suggested that, as Tanusha was saying, that this term is going to be very different. All right, this term is going to be about the restructuring of the global international order. America is looking to break down some of the underpinnings that structured the world in the post-Bretton Woods order that demand a lot more English is defying me at the moment, and they look to review their alignments around the world, expecting that if they give, all right, they expect something in reciprocation, and if you are misaligned with their particular policy, rather, they would not treat you with kid gloves anymore. And I think this is the moment that we as South Africa didn't prepare adequately for. I think a lot of the current administration was expecting to engage with America in a similar way that they were engaging with the Biden administration, not recognizing that a new individual was in charge in Washington. And this individual won't be as kind, and they won't treat South Africa with the kind of kid gloves that we saw Biden treat South Africa with. But what's been encouraging is that there appears to be a period of learning within the South African administration. We hear that there have been back-channel diplomatic engagements. We hear that they've also tapped up elements within the private sector. And we are seeing an evolution towards managing this relationship, managing message discipline when it comes to the United States, also trying to soften up the rhetoric around contentious issues, and also trying to preserve really beneficial economic relations with the US. So initially, the response left a lot to be desired, but we are adapting. And as the two other interlocutors said, it's going to be a long and it's going to be a tough process, but it's becoming a lot more encouraging, the response from South Africa so far.
Philani, where will restraint get South Africa? Hasn't worked so far.
Well, I think we have to ask ourselves, what is the alternative? The alternative is, does South Africa return the same type of rhetoric that it is receiving from the US? And the answer overwhelmingly is no. It is not in South Africa's interest to further escalate. Let it be clear, both to the South African domestic audience, but also to the international community, that what you have is essentially a one-sided fight. South Africa is not looking to fight with the United States. It's not looking to escalate tensions with the US. South Africa has its own priorities, namely unemployment, poverty, and inequality. It is seeking to extend its international relations to both countries in the global north and countries in the global south, but also prioritizing the African continent. And so I think what South Africa is doing by its restraint is it's making it quite clear that the attacks that are essentially coming from the US are not because of a provocation from South Africa, but they are as a result of thinking positions that have already been consolidated within the US. So whether South Africa returns the same type of rhetoric to Washington, or whether it remains restrained, focuses on its G20 presidency, focuses on building its relations within the African continent, focuses on consolidating its economic relations with the US business community. I think that is the message that South Africa is basically communicating, including within the G20. If South Africa's G20 presidency and its success will not be marked by whether the US participates at the highest of levels. But if South Africa is able to build consensus amongst the membership within the G20, both countries in the global south and the global north, and if at the end of it all, the US chooses to not be part of a joint communique, rather than conveying a message about South Africa, that will actually convey more of a message about the US and the type of administration that is at the helm, which is essentially seeking to reevaluate all of its international partnerships, its role in multilateral fora. And so it will communicate a message that it has nothing much to do with South Africa per se, but by the decisions that are coming from the White House and to a large extent unprovoked. So South Africa is remaining mature. It's showing that it is the adult in the room. And rather than seeking to amplify the tensions, it's seeking to actually de-escalate.
Yeah, Sanusha, the Secretary of State, the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has actually criticized South Africa's theme for the G20, which is about sustainability and equality as a bad thing. And the Trump government has also gone against what they call the day in the U.S., the diversity, equality, and inclusiveness policy in the U.S. Why do South Africa's values offend the U.S. government, the current U.S. government, so much?
I think, Ronald, it's really the question around what's happening internally in the US around the diversity, equity, and inclusivity issues. I think there are many kinds of dynamics that mirror how South Africa deals with transformation. It's built within our constitution. We've gone through the period of apartheid. And of course, it also mirrors the kind of challenges that exist in terms of the economic and the socio-economic transformation on both sides of society. We have a policy around transformation. It may not be perfect. I don't think there's ever going to be a perfect fit, a perfect kind of transformation. But it actually is antithetical to what is going on in the US in terms of the way in which the Trump presidency has surrounded itself by people that have gone, and some of them basically have their roots in apartheid South Africa, have gone against the grain around inclusivity. And so it kind of unbundles, and it represents a foundational shift within not just the question of the US, but it's also the question on global issues around inclusivity. And that kind of irks the US. It irks the Trump presidency. And if you go back and you look at the studies that have been done in the US around what is going to be the diversity of that society from a demographic perspective, look at what the census data has produced. By 2040, you're going to have a kind of shift between the minority and the majority. The minority is going to become people that are basically white sections of the white population that are going to become the minority, and the majority is going to become your foreigners, your Hispanics, your Black African Americans, your what you call this, your Native Americans, etc. So I think the challenge is that it is about how do you deal with that DEI. But again, in the case of South Africa, we represent this in the context of our values, our interests, and it's always been part of our foreign policy principles, and it's been part of our constitution. So you're actually going and you're telling us Another country is telling us that our domestic policies are incorrect because we're trying to transform and reconfigure the past. If you look at land in this country, land is still very much a very emotive issue. But if you look at the question of ownership of assets on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, it's still very much not part and parcel of transformation. So I think what South Africa represents, it represents that cog for where the US should be as the land of the free, the democracy everybody alludes to, but it's not there in the context of transformation. And so it's a pushback against that, and it's easy to basically flare up against us, because I think it represents that kind of very intrinsic challenge that is undermining the international system again around this issue that we don't have inclusivity, we don't have equivalency, and we saw it with the COVID-19 issues. We saw it in terms of how the Western world and Western pharmaceutical companies first put their people first and then sold expired vaccines to Africa.
Thank you, Sanusha. Menzi, before I come to you, I'd like to sample some of our the feedback we got from our poll question from our viewers, and they're very interesting. Someone here said, stand up for yourself. They're telling South Africa, BRICS is powerful. Don't bow down to these imperialists who did nothing but exploited every single African country for decades. And Batoba said, South Africa is an independent, sovereign country, and we won't be intimidated or bullied by President Trump. Only South Africa can influence South Africa and determine which direction this sovereign nation takes. And another viewer said, long live Ramaphosa and South Africa and Julius Malema. Menzi, it's fair to say that even before because South Africa's case against genocide case against Israel at the ICJ has been mentioned lots of times in trying to analyze the current state of US-South Africa ties. But it's fair to say that even before the genocide case at the ICJ happened, in I think 2022, I forget the year, and you can remind me here. Then U.S. Ambassador to Pretoria, Ruben Brigetti, accused South Africa of supplying weapons to Russia to fight its war in Ukraine, and this claim was later proven to be not true. And some people said that this is the point that South Africa lost the initiative, because the comments made by Brigetti to the media were really, really, really serious and jeopardized South Africa-US relations in a major way. But the fact that nothing happened to him and he stayed in the country, some people say South Africa's government invited the sort of things that are happening to it now.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. So in response, you are quite right in saying that the point of deterioration that we're at now has been forthcoming for a while now. In fact, it goes back beyond the Brigetti moment. It goes to Operation Mosi. And Dr. Philani also spoke about having to manage, or South Africa having to manage the relationship between South Africa and the US. And as he also mentioned, it speaks to a fundamental difference between, or rather a discord between South Africa and the US when it comes to politics. The economics has been all right, but the politics has been a point of contention between South Africa and the US. And what we've seen from Trump, all right, is once again a demand that if we are going to sponsor you on the economic front, if we are going to partner with you, if we're going to invest with you, if we are going to have a trade deficit with you folks, then you guys are going to have to align with us. And how they're doing is through different vectors, all right? One of them is doubling down on South Africa's domestic policy and also trying to pass down on our moral legitimacy through pointing out the issue and obfuscating in many ways the issue around farm murders, obfuscating the issue around BEE and other forms of corrective policies, and also obfuscating our foreign policy position. Now, the question is, what can we do around that? And I understand the frustrations that South Africa should stand up, it should punch back. But again, we have to be conscious of our position vis-a-vis America and their capability to hurt us. Right? It's no point trying to stand up and to punch back at someone that has bigger fists and is a bigger fighter. So we have to be a lot more tactful in our retaliation. And once again, I go back to the point that I made earlier. All right, we are seeing a response. It might not necessarily be satisfactory. It might not necessarily be as combative as the likes of Mexico, as the likes of Canada, who have far more leverage against the United States. But given our position, we are seeing avenues, we're seeing the exploitation of diplomatic channels to try and cool tensions, all right, to try and rebalance relations and to try and pinch America's hand and sensitize them to the truth. And unfortunately, this is the path that we are going to have to take if we want to maintain those relations with the US, which I would argue are essential for South Africa. The US has about 600 companies in South Africa. We need those for economic growth. We need those for employment. They are the biggest holders of South African government debt, I believe, all right? Outside of South Africa, rather. We need that, all right? They effectively sponsor our government. We have one of the largest amounts of two-way trade with the US outside of China and the EU as a body. We need that. So we have to be conscious of that and be conscious of what we have to lose if we respond in a particular manner. And I think the measured response, all right, the calculated response is probably the most prudent way to go about responding, given the complexities, given the erratic nature, the hawkish nature rather, of the Trump administration.
Philani, what about criticism that the ANC took too long to take the kind of corrective measures that it is taking now, measures like the Land Expropriation Act? You know, any measures that are being done to reduce the inequality that is a product of South Africa's past of apartheid. The criticism is that now it is too sensitive to do such things. They could have done them 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
I think if you just walk in the streets of South Africa and you ask most South Africans, most people would agree with you. They would say that we should have moved faster, with greater speed, much earlier in terms of our democratic breakthrough in 1994. The reality is that we also have to understand South Africa's political economy. The ANC might have achieved, political authority in 1994. However, the economy largely remained the same. The structure of the South African economy, those who benefited from the apartheid system have been one of the largest beneficiaries of South Africa's democratization and of South Africa becoming a good citizen in the world. So actually, the vast majority of the population would agree with that, with saying South Africa should have moved faster. The irony is that the Trump administration accuses South Africa of essentially confiscating land, and when the vast majority of the South African population are actually saying the South African government has been too slow in doing that, or when the vast majority of the population are actually saying which land is being confiscated. So the vast majority would actually say, if indeed the Trump administration was seeking to punish South Africa, for taking land, many of them would actually say, you would rather be punished for doing something that you are actually doing rather than being punished for something that you're actually not doing.
Mhm.
So that's the dilemma that we are faced with. And I would argue that not having transformed, the society and the structure of the economy as rapidly as it could have, has over time weakened the ANC. And we see now that obviously we have a government of national unity within South Africa, where the ANC co-governs with others. So enacting those measures has become more complicated now than it was in 1994 or in the year 2000, for that matter.
Indeed. Sanusha, Pilani talks about the current state of South Africa's politics. The ANC is locked in a marriage with the DA. I mean, and that was, I think, unimaginable before 2024. So how much legroom do they have to pull off, such radical measures to reduce inequality in South Africa, with the way the politics is at the moment, with the people with the parties that they are governing with?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I won't call it a marriage, I'll call it an awkward embrace between the DA and the ANC, because this is what one of the Afrikaner professors, Jeremy Gilomi, wrote about the transition in 94 between the ANC and the post-apartheid transition. They called it an awkward embrace. And I think we're kind of coming full circle, not necessarily full circle, but we're coming back to some of those dynamics around what has been the political economy that Palani touched on. And the big challenge around this is inequality. Inequality, I think, is the front and center of not just for South Africa, but I think inequality has become a very difficult and a very kind of important dynamic where generations to come are going to be faced with massive amounts of inequality that is not basically their own, but passed down by intergenerational inequality. And so where the ANC is today, I think in many ways, it's in the same dilemma like most countries are, is how to deal with inequality that is not just about structural inequality, but it's about inequality that has been passed down by generations. The challenge I think we have is this perception that South Africa is and based on the indices that we look at, we say that South Africa is the most unequal society in the world based on the Gini coefficient. But I think what is really challenging for us is this question of the architecture of the framework we use on the basis that the model of economic growth is going to be the panacea for everybody. And that is now in question. So what you're really seeing in the context of the debate we're having today about this dilemma between South Africa and the US is really a question for the US as well. It's a question for Europe as well. It's a question for Asia as well. It's a question for South America, Latin America, and of course Europe, because the inequality question is not just about how we deal with it as the ANC. It is how we deal with it as a global community, the collective consciousness that we want to include people into the economic architecture of not creating competition. That competition is good because competition creates growth, but creating the question of inclusive development that creates growth. And so we're entering into a very diabolical and dialectic question around the international political economy, not just about the ANC. And it requires us to think about whether the model that we've been using, some call it the gross domestic product model, and some call it the gross domestic problem model, is that it doesn't suffice. If you actually use growth as an indicator to determine inequality, then the question you should be asking yourself is, where is the development in that growth, and how does it translate into inclusivity and equality? And so the model has never been built for that. It has been built to create the rules of the game for certain of the individuals who now are beginning to realize that when China joined the WTO in 2001, the rules of the game was that we will benefit out of China's engagement and keep China in a space.
Yeah.
China actually managed and adapted that WTO entry and played the same rules and became the workshop and the engine of the world. And today, China is the second most, if not the most powerful economy that's disrupting the electric vehicle market.
Absolutely. Menzi, the tweets by Elon Musk, for example, about white genocide. I mean, the President Ramaphosa was quick to dismiss those. Him saying that South Africa is a very racist society, and because of the racism, some businesses are not allowed to operate in South Africa. Would you say that South Africa is the subject, the victim of a misinformation attack, and how does it fight back? Because you have a very influential person. Musk's tweets are always, they get a lot of feedback. The tweet about white genocide was also quoted by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and they keep going. How does South Africa respond to something like that?
Yeah, I think you're quite correct in saying that South Africa has been subject to a misinformation attack. And that again plays into this narrative of trying to compromise South Africa's moral legitimacy by looking at corrective policies that can be deemed contentious depending on where you stand on the political spectrum. So we've seen them attack South Africa's land reform policy. All right. We've seen them attack South Africa's BEE policy, which we know has affected Mr. Musk and his commercial endeavors in some sense, linked to Starlink. We've seen them attack South Africa's foreign policy agenda. And again, most of these, actually all of these attacks have not been based on fact. In fact, they've completely ignored the fact, they've completely ignored the underpinning legislatures. And to be fair, they're not aimed at anything constructive, especially when it comes to South Africa. They are intended for specific political, commercial, and you could call it personalistic ends for the US, for Trump's near or for Trump's orbit of allies, and for the US's allies. All right. So we know that some of the attacks on South Africa's BEE laws by Elon Musk are in response to a bit of a tip that he is having with regulatory authorities over the entry of Starlink. We know that some of the attacks on, or rather the misinformation around farm murders and minority rights are fueled by South African ethno-nationalistic groups, all right, that are trying to fuel a particular perception in the United States, hoping to elicit a particular response. And we know that the US's tip with respect to South Africa's ICJ case against Israel is aimed at prompting South Africa to pivot away from that. Okay, so the objective is not to establish any kind of truth around the matters. It is to service some kind of political and commercial end. Now, how do we respond? It's a very difficult one, and if I had the answers, I'd be very wealthy right now. But I think some of the measures that we're seeing the government take, once again, which may not be as confrontational or as conspicuous as people expect, have been quite prudent. All right. So we have seen, one, the South African government deploy convoys to Washington. One is coming back, or has arrived rather from Washington today, in the hopes of sensitizing the American public and also the American government around these issues. All right, we are also seeing conversations around BEE. We're seeing individuals rather within the private sector, all right, being tapped up to engage with their fellows in America, American companies based in South Africa, to engage with American companies about their experience with working in South Africa. All right, and we've also seen other attempts at correcting the messages from the foreign policy perspective. So what we can do is fairly limited, unfortunately, and it often boils down to being pragmatic and optimizing around the constraints that we have, going against what is the world's largest superpower. So we have to be pragmatic and use the channels that are available to us, which I think the government is doing a better job of.
Philani, all societies have their own, fault lines. Some are unique, and South Africa too has its own fault lines. I mean, no society is perfect, but when you get influential people like Elon Musk, for example, saying there's a white genocide in South Africa, are such things, you think, meant to incite a race war or a conflict of sorts? And how close are you to one as South Africa?
South Africa is very far from some kind of a race war, but I would say that what's worse than misinformation is disinformation. Disinformation is intentionally created to sow division. It's intentionally created to cast doubt, to disrupt social cohesion within societies. At times, people retweet things that they have not verified the information. That can count as misinformation. But when it's intentional, you cannot tell me that people who are relatively smart, who get briefings, who have, a sophisticated intelligence agency, who have embassies all over the world, are not aware of what's happening in South Africa. Mm-hmm. So it is intentional. The intent is indeed to try and further sharpen some of the potential divisions within South Africa. But I think the best way that South Africa rebuffs those efforts is by focusing on our own project of national reconciliation, nation building. We have a national dialogue process that is underway quite soon, led by some of the foundations, the political parties. So the way that South Africa can counter is by having greater social cohesion within, by remaining committed to the values that South Africa subscribed to through its constitution, through principles and values such as non-racialism, which is essentially what has led South Africa to where it is today. You must remember that there are people in South Africa, a very small minority, and there are also people who left South Africa in the early 90s, some in the 80s, who expected that once majority rule became the norm in South Africa, that the black majority would essentially behave in the same way that the white minority behaved towards the majority. Instead, the black majority showed its humanity and showed that there is no need for retribution. There is no need for revenge. What we are focused on is building a cohesive society that is inclusive of everyone.
Thank you, Philani. Can I end with Sanusha? Sanusha, just
go ahead.
1 minute. How do you see this end? For how long is South Africa going to continue to hold out? What if more attacks come? 1 minute, please.
Well, I don't think it can get any worse than this. I think we've seen what we've seen. And I think the measure of all of this is now what's going to happen in the US. Because when they go into midterms next year, they're going to be voting on the promises that the Trump presidency made. And whilst you start thinking about the tariff impacts, which is tomorrow or today or tomorrow when they start implementing, it's going to have an impact on the automotive sector in Michigan, questions around the muzzling and the pushback against freedom of speech at universities. I think right now, what we have to be is much more aware that the situation in the US is becoming dire for the US. And so as you saw what the president of the EU said, the EU Commission said recently, and what the EU has been also talking about is we will not allow this to become a bully for us. So this is not just about South Africa. This is about the world.
Okay. Sanusha Naidu, Menzin Lovo, and Dr. Philani Mthembu, thank you very much. Brilliant thoughts. And thank you very much for watching this episode of the African News Debates. My name is Ronald Kato. I'll see you on the next edition of the show. Bye.